The courtroom in Riverside City felt frozen in time, as if every breath had been suspended in the air. Seasoned jurors sat stiffly in their seats, shuffling papers just to break the unbearable silence. The fluorescent lights hummed above them, cold and unfeeling. And then, without warning, an 8-year-old black boy rose from his chair, clutching a handmade folder against his chest like a shield forged from truth itself. His name was Caleb Rivers. Small in stature, but standing with a resolve that seemed far too heavy for a child to carry, he took one step forward. It was enough to make every head in the courtroom lift, as if pulled by an invisible string. A ripple passed through the jurors. The prosecutor's jaw tightened. Judge Ellis froze, pen dangling above the page. In 30 years on the bench, he had never witnessed anything like this moment. Because nothing about this scene made sense. Not in a courtroom built to intimidate. Not in a system that rarely bends for the vulnerable. Yet here stood a child prepared to face it all. Caleb cleared his throat, voice steady in a way that felt impossible for someone his age. "Your Honor," he said, every syllable echoing against oak walls and uneasy hearts, "I would like to speak in defense of my grandmother, Evelyn Rivers." The words struck the room like a fault line splitting open. Jurors shifted. A murmur flickered through the back row. Even the prosecutor, Dr. Malcolm Graves, narrowed his eyes, as if trying to understand how an 8-year-old had just derailed his perfectly calculated case. It felt as though every soul present understood something monumental was about to unfold, a shocking truth waiting to erupt. And if, in this very moment, you can already sense that something extraordinary is coming, that justice is about to walk into the light through the voice of a child, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment. Let YouTube know you believe in justice, in truth, and in stories that refuse to stay silent. Long before the courtroom ever heard his voice, Caleb Rivers had already lived through storms that would have crushed most adults. 2 years earlier, a single moment on a rain-slick highway had taken both his parents from him. One second they were driving home from his school performance, and the next, the world folded in on itself. The drunk driver survived. His parents did not. Caleb, only 6 at the time, carried the kind of grief that ages a child overnight. In the aftermath, while the world continued its usual noise, he fell into a silence so deep it frightened those who tried to comfort him. He refused to speak for months. The only person he allowed near his broken heart was his grandmother, Evelyn Rivers. She became his anchor, his refuge, the only constant left after life had taken everything else. And Evelyn, despite her age and her weary bones, rose to the challenge with the strength of someone who had spent her entire life choosing compassion over convenience. For 15 years, she had served their community through the Riverside Haven Housing Initiative, helping low-income families find safe homes without ever asking for a dime in return. To the people of Riverside City, she was more than a grandmother. She was a guardian of dignity, a quiet force of good. And to Caleb, she became the universe itself. Their evenings together became a ritual that stitched his shattered world back together. Every Sunday night, when the rest of the city went dark, the soft lamp in their kitchen lit up 2 figures at a worn wooden table. Evelyn would spread out the program's receipts, bills, and reports, and Caleb, still too small for his feet to touch the floor, would help sort them by color. Blue for expenses, yellow for income, green for donations. At first, it was simply something for his hands to do while his heart learned how to beat again. But over time, he began to understand the rhythm of numbers, signatures, dates, and patterns. While other children were learning spelling lists, Caleb was learning the logic of accountability. While others memorized stories, Caleb memorized the structure of truth. And Evelyn, with all her patience, nurtured that spark without ever imagining it would one day ignite inside a courtroom. Yet on the day she was accused of stealing from the very program she had built with her bare hands, the same program she had sacrificed her health for, Caleb felt something inside him rise. Something still tender but unbreakable. It was the moment he realized he had already lost too much to stay silent again. Across the aisle, Prosecutor Malcolm Graves seemed offended that a child was even present. There was a sharpness in his gaze, the unmistakable look of a man who believed the verdict should fall before the evidence ever stood a chance. To him, Evelyn was an easy target, elderly, poor, black, and without legal counsel. And Caleb, small and soft-spoken, appeared to be nothing more than a sad footnote in the case. But appearances, as the courtroom was about to learn, can be catastrophically misleading. Judge Ellis, steady but cautious, wrestled with the irregularity of the situation. Allowing a child to speak was unheard of, yet something in Caleb's posture, in the way he held that makeshift folder against his heart, seemed to demand that justice open at least one small door. And so he did. 5 minutes. That was all Caleb was given. 5 minutes to defend the woman who had saved his life in every way that mattered. 5 minutes against a system built to silence voices like his. 5 minutes that would change everything. If you have ever witnessed injustice or felt powerless in the face of something larger than you, comment "Justice Matters" below, because sometimes the smallest voices carry the most unstoppable truth. Caleb lifted the handmade folder as if it were a lantern meant to expose everything the courtroom had chosen not to see. The moment he opened it, papers unfurled like wings, revealing sketches, color-coded notes, photocopies, and diagrams drawn with the careful precision of someone who had spent hours hunched over a kitchen table, studying while the rest of the world slept. It looked chaotic at first glance, a child's collage of scattered colors, but as he began to speak, the room realized it was not chaos at all. It was strategy. It was structure. It was a map of the truth, created by an 8-year-old who understood patterns the way others understood breathing. He pointed to a set of receipts marked in blue. Blue, he explained, meant expenses. "Your Honor, this withdrawal," he said, tapping one page with a small but unwavering finger, was listed as an emergency roof repair at the Riverside Community Center. His voice carried a quiet authority, one that seemed to ripple through the air. "But when my grandmother took me there the next morning, the roof was perfect. No repairs, not even a missing shingle." He held up a photo taken on Evelyn's old phone. The image was grainy, but clear enough to show the untouched rooftop under a pale morning sky. A murmur ran through the courtroom, the kind that comes when people begin to question the ground they're standing on. Judge Ellis leaned forward. Several jurors exchanged glances, trying to reconcile what they were hearing with the prosecutor's confident accusations. Graves shifted in his chair, the stiff collar of his shirt suddenly looking too tight for comfort. But Caleb wasn't finished. He flipped to another set of papers, this time highlighted in green. Green, he said, was for equipment. "Here is the purchase order for new security devices," he continued. $1,800. He let the number hang for a moment, heavy and deliberate. But the community center never received any equipment. There were no new cameras, no new alarms, nothing. A soft gasp slipped from someone in the jury box. Another leaned closer, elbows on knees, fully captured now, unable to look away from the child dismantling a case built by a man with decades more experience. Graves opened his mouth to object, but the words faltered. He cleared his throat instead, attempting to recompose himself, but the tension had already betrayed him. Caleb's eyes, bright and razor-sharp, did not waver. "These transactions don't match reality," he said. "Anyone could see that." The power of that statement lingered in the air. Anyone could see that, but no one had. Not the investigators, not the prosecutor, not the system designed to catch wrongdoing. Only Caleb, only the child they expected to remain silent. And in that moment the courtroom's perception shifted. Subtly at first, like shadows rearranging themselves, but unmistakably. You could feel it in the way jurors leaned in the way the spectators held their breath, in the way Judge Ellis watched him not as a child out of place, but as someone revealing what the adults had chosen to overlook. Caleb wasn't just presenting evidence. He was exposing negligence. He was illuminating the blind spots of those who never imagined they could be wrong. He was the child who saw what the grown world had ignored. And with every word, every photograph, every color-coded note, the balance in that courtroom began to tip. Not because he shouted, not because he demanded power, but because truth, when spoken with innocence and certainty, has a way of silencing everything else. There was a reason Caleb carried himself with a calmness far beyond his 8 years. A reason his voice, though small, carried the weight of someone who had seen more than he ever should have. And as he stood in that courtroom revealing truths adults had ignored, it became impossible not to feel the story that shaped him pressing against every word he spoke. 2 years earlier, on a night soaked in rain and headlights, Caleb's world had been ripped apart without warning. His parents were driving home from his school performance, still praising him for a song he had been too shy to sing loudly, when a drunk driver ran a red light. The collision was violent, cruel, and unforgiving. By the time emergency crews arrived, his parents were gone. Caleb survived, but something inside him shut down. For nearly a year he didn't speak, not a single word. Doctors called it trauma-induced mutism. Neighbors whispered about how a child could endure so much and still wake up each morning. But Evelyn, his grandmother, refused to let the darkness swallow him. She sat by his bed night after night, reading aloud anything she could find. At first it was bedtime stories, then newspapers, then case summaries she brought home from her volunteer work, until eventually she found that the only thing that made him look up were legal documents, pages filled with rules, procedures, and the structure of justice. Most children his age wanted comic books. Caleb wanted clarity. He wanted order. He wanted to understand how the world could break someone who did everything right. Evelyn leaned into that spark, not knowing she was nurturing a gift the world would one day marvel at. She read to him about due process, evidence, burden of proof, and rights that could not be taken away. And even though he said nothing, he absorbed everything. He watched how sentences connected, how arguments were built, how truth was supposed to work, until the day he finally spoke again. It happened on a quiet afternoon when Evelyn was reviewing a neighbor's eviction letter. Caleb touched the paper, pointed at a line buried in the fine print, and whispered, "That's wrong." It was the first word he had spoken in nearly 11 months. And it wasn't grandma. It wasn't help. It wasn't yes or no. It was an objection. From that day on, something awakened in him, as though the language of justice had become the bridge back to himself. He began asking questions that startled adults, questions about why some people had protections while others did not, why some voices were heard and others dismissed, why truth needed defending. And Evelyn, who had only wanted to bring her grandson back to life, realized she was watching a mind unfold in real time, sharp and intuitive in ways she had never seen before. Now, in the Riverside courtroom, those who had initially dismissed Caleb as a frightened child began to see the truth forming in front of them. Jurors who had looked at him with pity now watched with something closer to awe. Judge Ellis, who had hesitated to let him speak at all, leaned back with a dawning realization that this child had stood in storms far fiercer than any legal confrontation, and even the prosecutor Graves, though unwilling to admit it, could not ignore the shift in the room. This was no ordinary witness. This was a survivor, a child stitched together with threads of loss and resilience, wielding knowledge like a lifeline. Caleb was no longer simply defending his grandmother. He was reminding the courtroom, one steady breath at a time, that sometimes the strongest voices come from those who once had none at all. Caleb did not pause. The moment the courtroom began to absorb his first 2 revelations, he turned another page in his handmade folder with the certainty of someone who knew the next blow would land even harder. His voice sharpened, steady and precise, as he lifted a set of documents clipped together with a red paper tab. Red, he explained, was for signatures. Signatures that were supposed to belong to Evelyn Rivers. Signatures that, to a trained eye, should have matched perfectly. "Your Honor," he said, holding up the first sheet, "this is my grandmother's real signature." The letters curved gently, each stroke soft and consistent, the handwriting of a woman who had signed thousands of forms with quiet patience. Then Caleb lifted another page, one of the signatures tied to the fraudulent withdrawals. This time, the strokes were harsh, heavy, pressed deep into the paper like someone had been in a hurry or trying too hard to imitate a hand they didn't understand. The contrast was jarring. He held the 2 side by side for the courtroom to see, turning them slowly so every juror, every spectator, every skeptic had a chance to compare them. A murmur rippled through the crowd again, louder this time, tinged with disbelief. Prosecutor Malcolm Graves shot up from his seat so abruptly his chair scraped across the floor. "Your Honor, this is absurd," he snapped, his composure cracking around the edges. "A child analyzing handwriting? He doesn't know the first thing about forensic signature verification." Caleb didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. Instead, he lowered the papers and looked directly at Graves with an expression too calm for an 8-year-old, too sharp for a man who believed he was untouchable. "Do you," Caleb asked, "have a professional handwriting analysis to prove the signatures are real?" The question landed like a punch to the ribs, clean, direct, impossible to dodge. Graves opened his mouth, but no answer came out. Not because Caleb was wrong, but because the prosecutor himself had never bothered to request any analysis at all. For a man who claimed the case was airtight, that omission felt like a crack big enough for the truth to burst through. Judge Ellis leaned back, eyes narrowing slightly. It was the look of a man beginning to reassess everything he thought he understood about the case, and perhaps about the people involved. The jurors noticed it too. Their attention drifted away from Graves, who suddenly seemed smaller, and fixed instead on the child who dismantled arguments with the precision of a scalpel. Caleb continued, undeterred by the prosecutor's silence. "I learned about handwriting analysis at the public library," he said. "Mrs. Helena Brooks helped me find the right books. She worked in law offices for 30 years. She taught me how signatures reveal pressure, rhythm, and consistency." He tapped the papers again. "These signatures don't match, not even close." His tone remained respectful, almost gentle, but the impact was brutal. Each word chipped away at the case Graves had constructed on assumptions, shortcuts, and prejudice. One juror inhaled sharply. Another sat forward, elbows on knees, studying the papers as if they themselves were now on trial. And perhaps they were in a way, not for guilt, but for whether they had allowed themselves to believe too quickly in a narrative that seemed convenient. Graves tried again to find footing, but every attempt collapsed under the weight of the evidence a child had gathered by doing what adults in power refused to do. Pay attention. It was the third blow in a row, and it shook the room. Caleb was no longer just challenging the prosecution. He was exposing a deeper truth, one the courtroom could no longer ignore. The child they underestimated had turned the case on its head, and with every passing second the balance of power shifted further toward him. With every word, Caleb made it clear, knowledge wasn't his weapon. It was his shield, and he wielded it with a clarity and confidence that left the entire courtroom reeling. Caleb could feel the courtroom tightening around him, the pressure building like a storm about to break. But instead of shrinking, he stepped deeper into the center of it, flipping to another section of his folder. The pages rustled like the turning of a tide. His voice, once soft, now carried an undercurrent of urgency, as if he knew the next revelation might finally crack open everything the prosecution had tried to control. "Your Honor," he began, "I would like to present evidence that proves my grandmother could not have made the transaction Dr. Graves claims she did." There was a shift in the air, subtle but unmistakable. Jurors straightened. Judge Ellis leaned forward. Even the spectators sensed they were approaching a point where the truth would either stand tall or collapse under its own weight. Caleb lifted a document stamped with the Riverside Mercy Medical Center seal. It looked too official, too adult to be in the hands of an 8-year-old. And yet, he held it with complete certainty, as if he had carried much heavier things in his life. "This is the medical report from the day the money went missing," he said. "It shows that I had an asthma attack and was admitted to the emergency room at 1 o'clock. He paused, letting his words sink into the silent room. "And my grandmother," he continued, "was with me from 1 p.m. until 5 p.m. She never left my side, not even for a minute." 4 hours. 4 hours of documented presence. There was no way around it. No loophole. No alternate explanation. A tremor went through the courtroom like the floor itself had shifted. One of the jurors blinked rapidly, trying to reconcile the airtight alibi with the tidy story the prosecution had painted just days earlier. Another leaned back, lips pressed into a thin, troubled line. All the while, Graves' face drained of color. It was happening slowly, painfully, but undeniably. For the first time since the trial began, the prosecutor looked unsure. Not angry, not irritated, but exposed. Caleb did not let the moment fade. He turned to another set of documents, this time pulling out a printed email and a note scribbled from a phone call. The prosecution claimed the building's security cameras weren't working, he said. But I called the security company myself last week. The room inhaled as one. They told me the cameras were fully operational. They even offered to give me the footage for free to help my grandmother. So the cameras did work. He looked directly at Graves. So why did you say they didn't? It wasn't shouted. It wasn't accusatory. It was something far more dangerous. It was honest. And the simplicity of the question hit the courtroom with more force than any dramatic outburst ever could. It was the kind of question only a child could ask without hesitation, and only a guilty man would fear. Graves shifted in his seat, a bead of sweat trailing down his temple. He tried to swallow, but the motion seemed to catch in his throat. The prosecutor, who once strutted into the courtroom with a 95% conviction rate, now looked like a man cornered in his own maze of shortcuts and assumptions. Caleb, standing small but unshakable before him, didn't break eye contact. Either the cameras were working, he said steadily, or you never checked. The words echoed, sharp and merciless. In a single sentence, the child had done what the defense attorneys, experts, and officials had failed to do. He had revealed the hollow spaces in the prosecution's case. The grown-up world, with all its rules and rituals, suddenly felt very fragile, and Caleb Rivers, the boy who once went months without speaking, now commanded the room with the quiet force of someone who had already survived the worst kind of loss. He was not just fighting for his grandmother, he was fighting to prove that truth, even when spoken by a child, could stand taller than the system built to silence it. For the first time, it became clear. This wasn't a courtroom anymore. It was a battlefield, and the smallest warrior in the room was winning. Before the courtroom ever witnessed Caleb unravel the prosecution's case thread by thread, there had been someone quietly shaping the way he thought, the way he questioned, the way he sought the truth. Her name was Helena Brooks. To the rest of Riverside City, she was just a retired librarian with a soft voice and silver hair that curled at her shoulders, but to Caleb she was something far more powerful. She was the first adult who didn't talk down to him, the first who didn't treat him as fragile glass after his parents' accident, the first who recognized that the boy sitting alone in the library wasn't simply reading legal texts to distract himself. He was studying them, consuming them, understanding them with a clarity she had only seen in seasoned paralegals. Helena Brooks had spent 30 years working behind the scenes in law offices across Illinois, watching attorneys win and lose battles not by how loud they argued, but by how precisely they questioned. She saw in Caleb something astonishing, not just intelligence, but instinct, so she taught him what she called the three-step trap. Step 1, ask a question so simple no opponent would dare refuse it. Step 2, follow it with a question that narrows the path, closing every escape route. Step 3, deliver the final question, the one that forces the opponent to either contradict themselves or expose what they never wanted revealed in the first place. She taught him to think several moves ahead, the way chess champions do, but with evidence instead of pieces. She showed him how silence can be louder than accusations, how truth, when presented calmly, becomes a weapon no one sees coming. And now, standing in the center of the Riverside courtroom, Caleb used every piece of wisdom she had given him. He faced Graves again, this time not with documents, but with strategy. His small hands rested lightly on the lectern, but his voice had gained that razor-sharp clarity Helena had practiced with him over countless afternoons in the library. "Dr. Graves," he said, "did you verify the security footage from the community center?" A simple question, impossible to refuse. Graves forced out, "The cameras were not operational that day." Step 1, accepted. Caleb nodded as though he expected this answer. "Did you speak directly to the security company?" Graves hesitated. The path narrowed. Step 2. The jurors were leaning forward now, every muscle tight, waiting for his response. "No," Graves admitted reluctantly. "My team handled that portion of the investigation." A faint tremble wove into his voice, something the courtroom had never heard from him before. And Caleb delivered step 3, the final blow. "So you did not personally confirm the cameras were broken, yet you stated as fact that they were." A silence heavier than anything before fell upon the room. Graves' lips parted, but no sound came out. He looked trapped, cornered not by an attorney, not by an expert witness, but by a child who understood the architecture of truth better than the man prosecuting the case. Caleb pressed on, his tone still respectful, still impossibly calm. "Dr. Graves, how many parts of this investigation did you verify yourself?" It wasn't just a question, it was a trapdoor, and Graves fell straight through it. He shifted in his seat, the sweat at his temple now unmistakable. The man who had walked into the courtroom, certain of an easy conviction, suddenly looked like someone being dismantled piece by piece. Helena Brooks had told Caleb that the strongest tactic in any courtroom isn't aggression, it's precision. And in that moment he displayed the kind of precision that left even Judge Ellis momentarily speechless. The boy wasn't just presenting evidence anymore, he was controlling the flow of the entire room. Jurors watched him, not Graves. Spectators held their breath as he spoke. Even the judge seemed to wait for Caleb's next move before reacting. And Graves, once confident and untouchable, realized with dawning horror that he was losing control not to a seasoned defense attorney, not to a carefully orchestrated legal team, but to an 8-year-old with a mind sharper than he had ever anticipated. For the first time, the prosecutor truly understood the danger in front of him, not the danger of losing the case, the danger of being exposed by a child who could see straight through every corner he had cut, every assumption he had made, every truth he had buried. In that moment it became clear to everyone watching, the smallest person in the room was the one leading it. And Graves, the man who thought he owned the courtroom, now stood face to face with the one person he never expected to fear, an 8-year-old boy who had learned how to turn questions into traps. And each trap was snapping shut. The tension in the courtroom had already reached a breaking point, but no one, not even Judge Ellis, not even Graves himself, was prepared for what Caleb did next. The boy took a slow breath, then reached into the deepest pocket of his backpack and pulled out a sealed manila envelope. It was thin, ordinary, unassuming. But the way he held it told everyone in the room that it carried something explosive, something final, something that would redraw the lines of power inside this courtroom forever. "Your Honor," Caleb said, voice steady but charged with the electricity of a moment no one could stop, "this envelope contains evidence my grandmother and I discovered. We wanted to give the real culprit a chance to come forward first." The room froze. Spectators stopped whispering mid-sentence. Jurors leaned so far forward their chairs creaked. Even the air felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for whatever storm would come next. Caleb continued, "But no one came forward, so I think it's time the truth does." Graves stiffened. Real fear flickered across his eyes, raw, unfiltered, impossible to hide, because he alone knew what could be inside that envelope. Judge Ellis gave a small nod, permission granted, and Caleb broke the seal. The sound of the envelope opening, just a soft rip of paper, echoed louder than a slammed gavel. He reached inside and pulled out a small digital recorder. Graves shot up from his seat. "Your Honor," but Caleb pressed play. And the courtroom fell into absolute, devastating silence. First came the voice of a man named Tony, uncertain, uneasy. Then came Graves' unmistakable voice, calm and cold as steel. "Just pin it on the old woman. It doesn't matter if she's guilty. My conviction rate cannot drop before the Attorney General's election." The words hit like a bomb. People gasped. One juror covered her mouth. Another shook his head in disbelief. Graves looked like the floor had dropped out from underneath him. But the recording continued, relentless. Tony's nervous reply, "What if someone checks the transactions, the signatures?" Graves' chilling answer, "No one's going to check. It's a poor black woman from a dying neighborhood. The jury will make up their minds before she even walks in." When the recording clicked to a stop, The silence that followed wasn't emptiness. It was impact. It was judgment. It was the kind of silence that only arrives when the truth shatters everything people thought they understood. Graves staggered backwards, collapsing into his chair. His hands trembled as if the very structure of his life was slipping out of his grip. But Caleb wasn't done. Not yet. The boy reached into the envelope again and pulled out printed text messages Graves had sent to Tony. The investigation needs to stay focused on the administrator. Do not waste time checking companies or signatures. I want this case closed in 2 weeks. A wave of outrage swept across the courtroom. This wasn't incompetence. This was corruption, intentional, calculated, cruel. And Caleb delivered the final blow, the one that would ensure Graves never crawled out from under the truth again. He lifted a bank statement. "This," he said, "is Dr. Graves' personal account." Another ripple of shock. 3 days after my grandmother was charged, Dr. Graves received a deposit of $25,000 from a shell company. He held the paper up high. The same shell company that received the fraudulent payments from Riverside Haven. It was over. Graves' world, the career he bragged about, the reputation he bullied others with, collapsed right there in front of everyone. His face drained of color. His breath came in short bursts. It was the look of a man who finally realized the one thing he never believed could happen. He had been outmatched, outplayed, unmasked, and by a child. Judge Ellis slammed his gavel, not in anger but in shock, in disbelief at the depth of wrongdoing now laid bare. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Gasps, whispers, people turning in their seats as if needing to witness Graves' downfall from every possible angle. Reporters scribbled frantically. Jurors looked sickened. Even the guard stiffened, sensing a shift in the moral gravity of the room. And right there, at the center of it all, stood Caleb Rivers, small, steady, unshaken. An 8-year-old boy who had just exposed a level of corruption that seasoned investigators had failed to uncover. A child who refused to let lies bury the truth. A grandson who would not let the system break the person who saved him. If you want more stories that expose injustice, stories where truth stands up even when no one expects it to, subscribe right now. Don't let stories like this get buried. The truth deserves witnesses. The truth deserves you. When the echoes of the recording finally faded, Judge Ellis no longer hesitated. His voice, firm yet shaken, cut through the chaos. All charges against Evelyn Rivers are hereby dismissed. The gavel struck once, but it felt like a thunderclap. Evelyn's shoulders collapsed in relief, tears slipping down her cheeks as she covered her mouth. For months, she had carried the unbearable weight of being framed, of being judged by strangers who didn't know her heart. Now, in a single breath, she was free, and it was her grandson who had delivered that freedom. Word spread fast. By the time court officers escorted a pale, trembling Malcolm Graves out of the room, reporters were already gathering like a rising tide outside the courthouse. Within hours, the Illinois State Prosecutorial Review Board had initiated a full investigation. Within days, Graves had been suspended, and within months he was removed from office, charged with corruption, obstruction of justice, and misconduct so severe it would become the cautionary tale law students studied for decades. The man who once boasted about his 95% conviction rate now faced a sentence of his own. A prison term and the permanent stain of betrayal against the justice system he had sworn to uphold. But while Graves' fall was steep and swift, Caleb's rise was something far more profound. 6 months after the trial that shook Riverside City, the doors of Riverside Law School opened for a very unusual guest speaker. Not a judge, not a legal scholar, not a senior attorney, but a 9-year-old boy with a calm smile and a binder tucked under his arm. Caleb Rivers walked to the front of the lecture hall as 300 law students stood and applauded. Many of them had watched his courtroom. Footage online, replaying the moment an 8-year-old unraveled corruption with nothing but reason, courage, and a devotion to truth. Caleb spoke softly, yet his words resonated with the kind of clarity that made even the most seasoned professors lean in. Justice, he told them, isn't about defeating someone. It's about protecting someone. It's about doing what's right, even when it's hard, even when you're scared, even when you're small. That moment marked the beginning of something bigger than the case that had thrust him into the spotlight. Inspired lawmakers drafted new legislation to prevent future injustice, requiring prosecutors to verify a defendant's physical presence at the time of an alleged crime before charges could move forward. When it passed, the bill was given a name, the Caleb Law, a tribute to the boy who proved that justice cannot depend on assumptions, shortcuts, or prejudice. It must depend on truth. And Caleb wasn't done. With the help of his mentor, Helena Brooks, he created the Caleb Initiative, an educational program that brought legal literacy into underserved public schools across Illinois. Children learned their basic rights, how to identify unfair treatment, how to advocate for themselves, and most importantly, how to recognize the power of their own voices. The first year, 5 schools joined, then 10, then 30. The program quickly grew beyond Riverside, beyond Illinois, reaching communities where children had never been told they deserved to be heard. Meanwhile, Evelyn Rivers, once nearly destroyed by false accusations, became a symbol of resilience. Invitations poured in from organizations across the state asking her to speak about integrity, community service, and the importance of transparent public programs. She accepted only some of them. The rest of her time she spent quietly volunteering, just as she had always done, refusing to let the world change who she was. And throughout all of this, Caleb remained a child. He still played basketball on weekends, still watched cartoons on lazy Sunday mornings, still got into trouble for forgetting to clean his room. But beneath that innocence lived a wisdom shaped by loss, love, and the understanding that doing the right thing often comes with a cost. People across the country followed his story, newspapers, talk shows, podcasts. Yet whenever someone asked him what he learned from everything, his answer never changed. When you know the truth, he'd say, you can fight for it. And he did. Not for fame, not for praise, but for Evelyn, for the community she served, for every child who had ever been told their voice didn't matter, and for every adult who had forgotten that it still could. As the sun set behind Riverside City one evening, Caleb stood outside the community center where everything had begun, the place where numbers were forged into lies, and where truth ultimately struck back. He looked up at the roof, the same untouched roof that had started the unraveling of a corrupt prosecutor's career. He smiled, knowing that truth had its own way of surviving. His story wasn't just a victory, it was a reminder that justice can rise from the smallest voices, that courage can live inside the most unlikely heroes, and that sometimes it takes an 8-year-old boy to remind the world what accountability really looks like. Caleb Rivers became more than a name in a courtroom transcript. He became a symbol, a spark, a promise that light can still break through even the darkest corners of the system. And for anyone listening now, his journey asked one quiet, powerful question. If a child can change the course of justice, what might you be capable of? In the end, what happened in that Riverside courtroom became more than a legal victory. It became a reminder, whispered first in one city and then echoed across the country, that justice is never as distant as it seems. Sometimes it rises from the smallest places, from an 8-year-old boy, from a handmade folder, from an unshakable belief that truth should never bow to power. Caleb Rivers didn't just change the outcome of a trial, he changed the way people thought about courage. He showed that you don't need age or status or authority to stand for what is right. You need love, you need knowledge, and you need the bravery to carry both into the places where fear once lived. His story reshaped a system, but more than that, it reshaped the hearts of those who witnessed it. Because if a child could dismantle corruption with nothing but clarity and compassion, then maybe justice wasn't as unreachable as people had been taught to believe. Maybe it lived in all of us, waiting for the moment we chose to use it. And now, as Caleb's legacy continues through new laws, new programs, and new voices rising behind his, I want to ask you something. Have you ever faced a moment when you had to fight for the truth, even when the world seemed too big, too loud, too unfair? Share your story in the comments. Your voice matters more than you think. And if you believe, as Caleb proved, that truth will always win in the end, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with someone who might need hope today. Let this be the reminder. Justice does not wait for permission. Sometimes it simply needs someone brave enough to speak.